Who likes red delicious apples? They are the worst apple. There's an apple that has only been engineered for shipping purposes and like it's terrible. It looks good and that's it. Hey everyone, I'm Claire Saffitz. We're in my home kitchen and today I'm showing you a recipe at a dessert person for Tarte Tatin. Tarte Tatin is a classic French recipe and to me it is just the top of the mountain in terms of pastry achievements. The combination of buttery pastry, caramel, and apples I think cannot be beat in a dessert. I think if you had to express fall in a dessert, this is it. Tarte Tatin is one of these recipes that's touted as being very simple, and it depends on what your definition of simple is. Yes, like there's very few ingredients. You have apples and sugar and pastry, and that's kind of it. But simple can also be very difficult, and Tarte Tatin to me is a very, very technical recipe that is hard to execute. The main issue in Tarte Tatin is that you have like too much, either it's about the apples, like you have too much liquid, not enough, you know, it's so dependent on the actual apples themselves and can be very, very tricky. And so this recipe breaks everything down into individual steps and also makes it so that you can start and stop at various points. You can pre-roast the apples, you can make the pastry ahead of time. You just have a lot more control. So let me show you what you'll need for this recipe. So you'll need a 10-inch skillet, which by most accounts is a medium skillet. You could use stainless steel. This one is like a cast iron. For making the pastry, you'll need a box grater, obviously a large mixing bowl, a rolling pin for your pastry. Most people have a Y peeler or any kind of peeler. For coring the apples, I like to use a melon baller, but if you don't have a melon baller, one thing you can use is a teaspoon measure. It's very low tech in terms of the equipment. This recipe is really all about the process. I was just thinking about where my love of apples comes from. This time of year, you see the most incredible bounty of apples at the farmer's market, and I just find them very inspiring to bake with. The cookbook has a lot of apple desserts because for me, in like my hierarchy of desserts, there's like desserts, then there's chocolate desserts, then there's fruit desserts, then there's apple desserts. Like to me, apple desserts occupy this really elevated place in the realm of desserts because they're just so delicious and apples are so wonderful to bake with. These I picked up at the farmer's market. I actually picked 3 different kinds. It's really nice to mix apple varieties because you get different flavors. So I like to bake with super, super firm apples. Let me show you a great tip. Every year I go apple picking, and years ago I was actually in the Boston area with my parents and we went apple picking. And an apple farmer, I was chatting with him and he gave me a great tip for how to know how, like, if you're using a really firm apple. You want to grip an apple like this, right? And then try to use your thumb to like press into the apple and make an indentation. And like, that is a sign that you have a fresh apple. So like these guys are really fresh apples, which I knew because they're coming from the farmer's market.
Let's see, give it a good try.
I mean, first of all, I have very weak hands and also like slight carpal tunnel. So I'm not, you want to try? You want to try?
Do you think Alex Lau could do it?
Yes, I think Alex Lau could basically turn this into apple cider in his hand. Try it, really. Put it like all the way in your hand and then try to push your thumb into it. Right? Right? All right, verified fresh. The apple roasting process is really simple. I'm just gonna put everything in the skillet, and this is the same skillet that I'm gonna make the tart in. I give a pretty wide range in terms of the time for roasting your apples. If you have super fresh, like very firm apples from the farmer's market, it could take a very long time for your apples to roast. If you're using supermarket apples or apples that have been in cold storage, they're not as firm, they've broken down a little bit, they're gonna roast a lot faster. So I'm gonna show you how I prep the apples. I like to shave off, I call them the poles, you know, the North Pole and the South Pole. And then with my peeler, just go in and like rotating with my other wrist. In terms of apple flavors for baking, I tend to like something that is a mix of sweet and tart, but I definitely lean tart. And now I can use my melon baller, and I just want to go in and take out the seeds and the center of that core. And now the last thing is just taking the knife again and slicing out any remaining parts of core. There's also, did you know that there's like tens of thousands of varieties of apples? Tens of thousands. And our whole lives, we grew up thinking there were only 3, Granny Smith, Golden Delicious, and Red Delicious, which the latter 2 are the worst kind of apple and would be enough to put anyone off of apples. But really, there's like a whole vast world of heirloom apples. There's just so many apples out there. There's an apple out there for everyone. So to roast these guys, I'm actually going to stand them up. At this stage, to get them going and to kind of perfume them, I'm adding some brandy. I hate like keeping 1 tablespoon of something. All right, so then to add a little bit of acid to balance out all the sweetness, I'm adding 1 teaspoon of apple cider vinegar. You might be sensing a theme. And then maple syrup. So obviously apples and maple are a wonderful combination. There's the saying, what grows together goes together. I want to create as airtight a seal as possible and just try to crimp the foil around the skillet. Again, I'm on 275, which is super low. So these are going to very, very slowly roast. I'm going to check them after maybe an hour, hour 15, and just kind of see how they're going. Oh, and in the meantime, we'll make the pastry. Now this recipe for the pastry, you have options. Basically, you can use a store-bought puff pastry. That's totally fine. But in the book, there's also a recipe for what I call a rough puff pastry, sort of a simplified, streamlined version of puff pastry. The recipe calls for a half portion of rough puff pastry. I'm gonna make the full recipe, and then I'll basically take the other half and freeze it. It's always wonderful to have like a little bit of pastry dough in the freezer for a rainy day. This is a European butter. European or European style butter has a higher fat content, but like use whatever butter you have available. So I have 3 sticks, which is 12 ounces. Now, half of this butter, I'm actually going to stick in the freezer because I want it to firm up, because I'm going to actually grate it with a box grater into the flour. Oh God, this freezer is kind of a disaster. Let's hope it doesn't fall out. I'm so nervous. Okay, good. Okay, all right, so then the rest of this, I am going to slice into just crosswise little squares. I'm going to slice it as thinly as possible. So the kind of basics of flaky pastry are keeping everything really cold. You want cold butter. And another principle is like discrete butter pieces. So it's having sheets of butter in the pastry that when they go into the oven, the water inside the butter turns to steam and it creates a puffing action, and those layers separate, and that's what gives you a flaky texture. Okay, back in the fridge while I measure the dry ingredients. So I always take flour from the store out of the bag and put it in a container like this. Basically, you just want it in something where it has a tight fitting lid so no critters get in it, and it's just easy to measure from. And then go ahead and level it. I'll say it every time I use kosher salt, but this is diamond kosher. If you're using Morton's, either weigh it and match the weight or use half the volume. So that's 1.5 teaspoons, 2 tablespoons sugar. All right, so I'm just gonna toss all this together. The first thing I'm gonna do is grate the butter that's been freezing with a box grater. So you wanna give the butter like maybe 10 minutes in the freezer. You don't want it frozen solid, but just cold enough that it's not gonna start to melt in your hand. When I grate it, I'll coat it in flour first, and that helps to prevent sticking. And work quickly, because that butter, with the heat of your hands, will certainly start to soften. So on a box grater, you want to really avoid grating your knuckles, which I've done many times, and it kind of sucks. So once you get to the end of the butter piece, don't be a hero, just throw the little nubbin into the bowl. And now you see what we have here are these discrete, firm butter shreds. So get all those shreds tossed, broken up, and coated in flour. Now it's time for those butter slices. So I'm not going to do anything to these pieces. These are going to stay exactly as they are in this shape. Did I just get flour on my face? Yep. I had an itch. Okay. So I'm going to measure the ice water. So I'm going to start with a 1/4 cup, and then I'm tossing with a fork. The idea is to like distribute that moisture as evenly as possible. And generally when it comes to pastry like this, I only want to add enough moisture to bring the dough together, but not so much that I'm making it into like a very wet, soft dough. So at this point, I like to switch to my hands and give everything a nice toss. And I'm being gentle with it. You can really overwork dough like this, so you want to kind of use a light hand and also work quickly. So it's like starting to clump. It's still very, you still have very dry floury spots, but it's starting to hold together. So I'm going to grab a piece of plastic. So I'm going to start to gently knead this dough and bring it together. So here I have like a big clump of dough. Don't worry if there's some dry, shaggy parts. That will all hydrate as the dough rests. And then with the really dry parts left in the bowl, I'm gonna bring this together with a bit more ice water. It's just this process of like leaving the drier stuff in the bowl and adding just enough water to bring it together and no more. Okay, so now I just wanna flatten this into a square. So one thing I always do with any kind of pastry is use the rolling pin and kind of force it into the shape that I want. And that like really helps to hydrate the dough. Okay, here. I have pastry that I made last night, and so it's been chilling for even longer than 2 hours. I'm gonna show you the next step in rough puff, which is rolling it out and folding. So here is my chilled pastry. You can see it's become really, really firm. And you can see how that butter has already started to spread out in a sheet. Before I use this, I could use this pastry now and just roll it out, but I like to do this kind of intermediate step of rolling it out and folding it, similar to how you would make true puff pastry. To get the butter pliable but still keep it cold, I like beat it with a rolling pin. I first saw Julia Child do this, and like she was a woman on a mission. I actually have my photo of Julia Child over there, my patron saint. Give it a little extra flour. So it's important to make sure that there's no sticking. So I like to move the pastry and give it like a turn. All right, so now I'm gonna do that folding. We call this a letter fold. It's pretty self-explanatory. You fold it like a letter. So I'm gonna fold the bottom third up and toward the center. And then the upper third over. Give it a little flour. So in order to roll it out, I'm gonna give it a little 90-degree rotation. And it should be easier to roll out at this stage because it's had a chance to soften a bit. So same thing. Fold up. Top third goes on top. I do this step to like thin it out a little bit and also just square off these sides. So we have to chill this again before we use it because all of that folding and rolling out is like working the dough. So this is gonna chill, and I'm gonna check my apples because even though it's been slightly less than an hour 15, I think that they're done. I have burned my hands on the handle of a skillet because I've forgotten that the skillet was in the oven. So one thing I'll often do is leave the towel on the handle just to remind myself. It smells so appley. All right, well, we've had some breaking apart of the apples. All right, we went a little over. What a great opportunity this is to illustrate something that I say in the recipe, which is that if your apple's overcooked a little bit, don't worry, they'll still make a great tarte tatin. This is too soft. Like I got no resistance, and obviously these guys turned into total mush. But like that, we can use all these. I'm not gonna panic because I overcooked my apples, but the reason I'm not panicking is because I already roasted them yesterday, and between this version and the ones I roasted yesterday, we have a lot to work with. If you have this issue and there's apples that broke down so much that you can't use them, like make apple compote from them. So just keep cooking them down. Okay, but actually I'm gonna stick these apples back in the fridge so that they can be cold when I go to assemble the tart. Now, This same skillet, we're using this to build and bake the tart. But first, I'm going to take these incredibly delicious, flavorful apple roasting juices and reduce it down, and that becomes this gorgeous shiny glaze for the top of the tart. All right, so this will just take a minute or two. So you can see it's really thickened. And once you see bubbling like this, where like the bubbles are getting bigger and they're slower, that's when you know you've gotten rid of a lot of the water. And now I'm gonna pour it through this strainer. We're just gonna let that cool. I'm gonna just rinse out this skillet. I don't need to really wash it. I just wanna get rid of any glaze residue. Oh, see? I didn't have the towel on it. So a couple of things about caramel. There's two styles of caramel. There's what's called a dry caramel and a wet caramel. Usually you'll see a wet caramel, and that just means that there's water added to the sugar. But for this recipe, I make a dry caramel. So I'm just melting the sugar and cooking it until it starts to turn golden. So I'm starting with a couple of tablespoons in an even layer in the bottom of the skillet. So you can see it's really starting to melt. So I'm just adding more sugar and sprinkling it on top of areas where it's melting. I think caramel is scary for people. There's this sense that it's like a little dicey, but just remember that you are in control of the caramel because you are in control of the heat. All right, so there's still some unmelted sugar, but that should melt soon. You can see there's like some graininess. What color do I say we go to? Continue to cook the sugar, stirring occasionally until it turns a deep amber color, moves very fluidly, and releases wisps of smoke. Sometimes I feel like smart when I read my own recipes. Like, what good indicators I left for people. All right, so I'm approaching that point. You can see the caramel's super fluid. It's smooth. I don't really see any graininess from unmelted sugar. So now I killed the heat. We don't want this to go too far. So now I'm gonna add my butter, a little bit at a time. That's just gonna add like delicious richness. Apples and butter and caramel, like I cannot think of a better combination. My kosher salt, and now I'm gonna add my apple cider vinegar. And this vinegar also is just going to balance out all that sweetness, like add a little acidity. So you can see the color of this caramel is really beautiful. And now I'm just gonna let this caramel settle. By the way, here's the glaze. You want it to be fluid, but not like super runny. But this is looking good. What? What? Don't jump up here. I'm not gonna feed you right now. Nope, nope, no, no, no. Felix, no, I can't have little kitty paws on my surface. Bad kitty. Get out of here. Get out of here, kitty. No. Bad kitty. Bad. The problem is I can't really scold him because he's the best. Okay. Go. Shield the food. I want a dog.
What kind of dog do you want?
A rescue. Like I'm not particular about breed. I prefer like a snout dog. Is there like a word for that?
That's just a dog. Schnauzer?
No, like a dog with a snout rather than like a flat face.
Don't want a French bulldog.
I don't want a French bulldog. They have breathing problems, it's the whole thing. I like retrievers, like sheepdog kind of breeds. Do you know what a Commodore looks like? The like dog whose hair is like a mop dog. Love that one. So here's my puff pastry. It is enough dough for 2 single crusts, so I'm only gonna use half. You can see the layers of butter in the pastry. Time to roll this out. It's gonna wanna be a rectangle, but we want it to be a circle. So that just means I have to do a little extra coaxing with my rolling pin. You can see how smooth the surface looks. It's so much smoother than it looks when we first rolled it out. And that just comes from letting it rest and hydrate. So now I just want to start kind of rotating it and getting it into something a little more circular. I can also go in and like try to press it into something like a circle. So I'm going to roll this out to like about 1/8 of an inch or a 12-inch round. This is a 10-inch dinner plate. So what I'm going to do is put this plate upside down, centered, and then cut around it leaving like a 1/2 inch border. Where's my pizza cutter? Am I looking at it? All right, whatever. I'm gonna use this. I can't find my pastry cutter. This will give it a crimped edge, which might look, that might look kind of weird though. Oh wait, oh, it's just the same thing. Whatever. All right, so I can't find my pizza cutter. The edge will just it'll just be fluted because all I can find is this cutter. So I'm just sort of eyeballing a 1/2 inch border all the way around. So now I'm gonna lift the plate off. I wanna do something called dock the pastry, which means poking holes in it, and that's to allow steam to escape. And this will go in the fridge also to rest. I just have one spot where stuff fits, and I'm just shuffling stuff in and out. The caramel has cooled, and as it cooled, it's hardened. And then we have our cooled apples, and we're arranging them rounded side down. So I'm trying to fit the apples in. So this is where like it's a little bit of a puzzle, and you're putting it together. Okay, so I have the apples all around the edges. I'm like, God, this is an involved recipe. There's a lot of steps in this recipe. But again, I highly recommend that you break up the steps. So like make the pastry 2 days in advance, roast the apples 1 day in advance, make the caramel in the morning. And then no one's having a dinner party, but like when your theoretical guests come over, that's when you can throw it in the oven. So this pastry goes right on top. So now I'm taking this spoon and I'm just going to use it to press the edge of that pastry down and around the apples. Like the idea is I'm tucking it into that little space between the side of the skillet and the apple. This is ready to go in the oven. We're done, finally. This is going into my 425 oven for about 20 minutes, and that's to give it that initial puff for the pastry, and then I'll turn it down to 350 and bake it until the pastry is golden all over, and I also will see some dark caramel bubbling around the sides. That's when I know it's done. So there you can see that caramel is bubbling around the edges, and the entire surface of the tart is golden brown. So I'm gonna let it sit for between 5 and 10 minutes, just so things can settle, and then we turn it out. So I have my wire rack. The idea is to invert the whole thing. I'm gonna do this over at the sink, which is what the recipe says to do, because there will be some hot caramel, and I don't want that to like fall on my stove or my floor or my arms. Yep, see those drips? I don't think any apples stuck based on how much liquid there was, but if you do have a stuck apple, just scrape it off and mush it back into place. Oh yes. Oh, thank God. I was nervous. This looks so beautiful. You can see that the apples did not further break down, even though a lot of these apples were quite soft when they went into the tart. Because of the sugar in there, they basically like candy in a sense. So while the tart is still warm, I'm gonna go ahead and glaze the apples. Whenever you're glazing anything, it's always better to use a dabbing motion rather than a brushing motion. And that eliminates the possibility of like streakiness from the bristles. I like serving it warm, but you just don't want to cut it hot because you want that pastry to have a chance to cool. As it cools, it will let off some steam and like re-harden and firm up, because the best thing about tarte tatin is cutting through that apple with a fork and then getting to the pastry and having it be like crispy and delicious. The tart has had a chance to cool. We're ready to taste it. And I love how almost like custardy the apples get. You can see the color, like they've absorbed that caramel. This tart is good. This is a good tart. Here you can see some good flakiness from that puff pastry. I highly recommend Haagen-Dazs vanilla ice cream with this, or any vanilla. I don't have any, I'm just gonna eat this piece. My favorite Julia Child quote, or one of my favorite Julia Child quotes, is "A party without cake is just a meeting." And I would take that and just say a party without dessert is just a meeting. And like, this is so festive. Anything is a party when you bring a Tarte Tatin. Hey everyone, it's Claire. It has been such a pleasure to show you recipes from my cookbook Dessert Person, and I want to show you another cookbook by a Penguin Random House author. This one is called Chaat by Maneet Chauhan and Jodi Eddy. This book is all about the sweet, spicy, savory flavors of Maneet's childhood growing up in India. She and Jodi traveled throughout India documenting the incredible street food of all the regions and cities, and that's how it's organized. It is such a beautiful book filled with incredible photography. I highly recommend it. You should check it out. You might know Maneet from her judging on Chopped, and she also is a restaurateur in Nashville, so it's just a beautiful book. You can find it wherever books are sold.